The lake looked harmless that morning, quiet, obedient, like she used to be. Her daughter called her just an old woman with nothing left to offer. Helen Ward didn't argue. She rewrote the will. By dusk, Elise's name was gone, from the trust, the deed, and the future. Helen had hosted every holiday, held every silence. Now her silence would decide who mattered and who never did. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The lake looked harmless that morning, flat as glass, streaked with the silver light of early fall. Helen Ward stood on the dock with her hands shoved deep in the pockets of her cardigan, watching the fog lift from the water. It should have been peaceful. It used to be. Behind her, the house groaned awake. Floorboards creaked. The old refrigerator hummed to life, and she could hear Greg's low voice somewhere inside, trying not to wake Elise. The sound of him used to soothe her. Now it only reminded her of everything she'd lost control of. Helen had always been the calm one in the family, the center. She'd hosted every Thanksgiving, balanced every argument, filled every silence. But since her husband Malcolm's stroke 6 months ago, something inside her family had shifted. Elise, her daughter, had started showing up less, calling only when she needed something. And Greg, Elise's husband, well, he smiled too easily, spoke too carefully, like a man who'd learned how to stay on the safe side of someone dangerous. Helen turned from the water when she heard the back door open. Greg stepped out with 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling into the chilly air. "Didn't expect you up this early," he said, offering her one. "Couldn't sleep," he nodded. "Big day ahead. Elise said you're meeting the lawyer today?" She did. Helen took the mug, her hands grateful for the warmth. "Estate adjustments." Greg gave a soft whistle. "Always sounds serious when you put it like that." Helen smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "It is." They stood there for a moment, the silence filling with the sound of gulls. Greg's tone was friendly, but his glance lingered too long, curious, maybe cautious. Helen knew the look. She'd seen it before, back when she was the one holding the power in the family. Now everyone seemed to be circling, waiting for her to decide who still mattered once her estate changed hands. Inside, the screen door slammed. Elise's voice carried sharp through the morning air. "Mom, are you seriously talking business already? It's not even 8. Helen turned slowly. Elise stood barefoot on the porch, messy hair, an oversized sweatshirt hanging off her shoulder. She looked younger than 34, petulant, impatient, like she hadn't grown past being the center of every conversation. "We were just talking," Helen said evenly. "Uh-huh." Elise rolled her eyes. "Well, don't wear him out before breakfast, okay?" Greg's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He set his mug down on the railing. "I'll go get things started inside." When he disappeared through the door, the air between Helen and her daughter changed, thinned, went cold. "You don't have to do that," Helen said quietly. "Do what?" "Make everything a performance." Elise laughed under her breath. "God, you're dramatic." Helen said nothing. She'd learned that silence was her sharpest tool now, subtle, cutting in ways that words couldn't be. Elise hated it. "Don't look at me like that," Elise snapped. "You're the one calling the lawyer, not me." "I'm making arrangements," Helen replied. "That's what people my age do." "People your age, sure, but you're not most people, Mom. You can't just—" She stopped herself, bit the inside of her cheek, then muttered, "Never mind." Helen waited. "Say it." "No," Elise said, her voice brittle. "Because if I do, you'll turn it into another guilt trip. Like always." And with that, she went back inside, the door banging behind her. Helen stayed where she was, coffee cooling in her hands, eyes tracing the still water until it shimmered into blur. A gust of wind broke the surface, scattering her reflection into pieces. She whispered to no one, "I've already decided." Inside the house, the phone rang, a sharp, insistent sound that sliced through the quiet. Helen turned toward it, heart quickening. Malcolm's lawyer was punctual to a fault. She walked inside, each step steady but deliberate, the faintest smile forming at the corner of her mouth. Whatever came next, her daughter would never see it coming. The downtown office smelled faintly of lemon oil, and old books, Malcolm's favorite combination. Even after 6 months of half-hearted cleaning, his touch lingered everywhere, a brass lamp angled just so, a crystal paperweight catching morning light, and the faint imprint of his handwriting framed on the wall, a quote from Faulkner, "Between grief and nothing, I will take grief." Helen stood in the doorway, binder clutched to her chest, and let the memory settle like dust. Her husband had once run this room like a general, every ledger balanced, every document pristine. He'd called it his sanctuary of order. She wondered what he'd think now, watching her prepare to dismantle the very order he'd left behind. Mrs. Ward, Malcolm's attorney, Raymond Dorsey, appeared from the adjoining room, a gray man with a polite smile and an unshakable calm. He'd handled their affairs for 20 years, through births, deaths, and one quiet marital near collapse. Helen smiled faintly. "Morning, Ray. You brought the trust binder, I see." She set it on the mahogany desk. The leather was worn, corners soft from decades of decisions. "I think it's time we make some changes." Ray gestured toward the chair across from him. "I assumed as much." She sat, smoothing the sleeve of her coat. The wool one Elise hated, calling it outdated, matronly. Helen wore it now precisely for that reason. Its scent of cedar and faint perfume made her feel rooted, immovable. Ray opened the binder, his finger pausing on the first page. "Current beneficiaries are Elise and Greg Ward, primary and contingent." Helen's tone was gentle. "That's correct. And it's no longer appropriate." He looked up, brows furrowing slightly. "No longer appropriate. How?" Helen's gaze didn't waver. "Reallocate all personal property and holdings. The lake cabin, downtown property, the art fund, jewelry portfolio, everything." Ray hesitated. "To whom, may I ask?" "Sophie," she said quietly, "and the Ward Art Foundation." He blinked, caught between professionalism and surprise. "Your granddaughter and the nonprofit?" "Yes." She folded her hands. "She's the only one who still sees beauty in things that aren't hers." Ray nodded slowly. "And Elise?" "She'll be fine," Helen said, though her voice softened on the word. "She's always been fine. She just never believed it." The sound of pen scratching on paper filled the space. Each stroke felt like a closing door. Helen watched the ink dry, as if it were sealing time itself. Ray read over the new draft carefully. "You're certain about this?" "Completely." He leaned back. "It's quite a shift. You're removing your daughter as primary beneficiary. If this gets contested—" "It won't," Helen interrupted gently. "She won't even know until it's too late." Ray studied her face, then exhaled. "Malcolm would have approved of how methodical you're being." That drew the faintest laugh from her. "He used to say I didn't know how to be ruthless. Guess we both underestimated me." Ray slid the final documents toward her. "Then all that's left is your signature." Her pen hovered for a beat. The room seemed to narrow, every tick of the wall clock amplified, every inhale a countdown. She signed once, then again. When she placed the pen down, her hand didn't tremble. Outside, rain began to patter softly against the window. Ray collected the papers with deliberate care. "I'll have these filed by end of day. Do you want Elise notified in advance?" Helen met his eyes. Calm as the lake had been that morning. "Not until it's too late." He gave a quiet nod. "Understood." When Helen rose, her knees ached slightly, but her stride was steady. She pulled her coat tight, feeling its familiar weight settle over her shoulders. As she walked toward the door, she caught her reflection in the glass. Gray hair pinned neatly, eyes sharp, a woman Elise had dismissed as outdated. Outside, the city had shifted from drizzle to full rain. Helen stepped into it without flinching. Cars hissed through puddles. The courthouse clock told noon, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel old. She felt precise. At the curb, she paused under the awning, opening her umbrella. Across the street, in the reflection of the law office window, she noticed a dark sedan idling. Its engine rumbled low, almost watchful. Helen frowned. Squinting through the rain, the driver's silhouette was indistinct, unmoving. After a moment, the car pulled away into traffic, leaving behind only a faint swirl of exhaust. She tightened her grip on the umbrella, the edge of her binder pressing firm against her ribs. Whatever Elise was planning next, Helen thought, she'd be ready. She turned toward the rain-slick street, eyes hard with resolve. The papers she'd signed were still warm in Ray's office. The ink hadn't even dried, and already the storm she'd set in motion had begun to move. The envelope was thin, no return address, no markings except Sophie's name, handwritten in her grandmother's steady script. It had arrived that morning, slipped between college catalogs and a dental reminder, so unassuming that Sophie almost tossed it aside with the junk mail. She sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, the late afternoon light washing everything in a soft amber haze. Outside, the wind pressed faintly against the windows, the kind of hush that made even the smallest sound, paper tearing, a breath drawn in, feel enormous. She broke the seal carefully. Inside lay a single folded letter and a crisp copy of a trust document embossed with the family lawyer's seal. Her heart gave a small, confused stutter. The letter began simply, "My Sophie, you always saw me, so now I see you. You never asked for anything, which is why I can finally give you something that matters. The lake will be yours someday. The quiet, the space to breathe, the sound of water that never lies. Don't let anyone convince you it's too much. You earned it by being kind when no one else knew how. Love, always. Grandma Helen." Sophie read it twice, then again. Her throat tightened as if the air had changed. For a long minute she just stared at the handwriting, the small loops, the slant of each letter, the faint indent where Helen must have paused before the word always. Her grandmother's scent, lavender and paper, seemed to rise from the page. Sophie could almost hear her voice, low, deliberate, patient in a way Elise never was. She folded the letter back along its creases and slid it into her sketchbook, between two unfinished charcoal portraits, one of the lake house dock, another of her grandmother sitting in the old wicker chair last summer. The trust document she tucked beneath it as if protecting it from view. Her phone buzzed on the bed. A text from Elise, dinner, no excuses. 7 p.m. sharp. Sophie sighed. She knew better than to ignore it. By the time she made it downstairs, the kitchen smelled of roasted garlic and lemon. Elise moved briskly between counter and stove, her motions clipped and efficient. Greg sat at the island, scrolling through something on his tablet, one knee bouncing restlessly. "Hey," Sophie said, sliding into a chair. Her mother turned briefly, forcing a smile. "Hey yourself, long day?" "Just school." Elise's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been quiet lately. Maybe I'm just tired." "Or hiding something," Elise said, her voice carrying that familiar teasing edge that wasn't quite teasing. Sophie froze mid-breath. Greg looked up then, studying her, really studying her. His tone when he spoke was mild but probing. "Your mom's right. You've been a little different, not checked out, more like intentional." Sophie blinked. "Intentional." He shrugged. "You used to fade into the background at these dinners. Now you look like you're waiting for something." Elise gave a soft laugh. "Maybe she's dating someone." Sophie forced a smile, her pulse quickening. "Not unless you count my sketchbook." Greg leaned his elbows on the counter. "Could be something else, something she's not ready to talk about." The word slid into the air like a blade. Elise turned to Sophie, expression tightening. "What's going on, Soph?" "Nothing," Sophie said too quickly. The silence that followed was sharp enough to make the air feel thinner. Greg's eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the coat rack where a faint trace of Helen's old scarf still hung, left behind after her last visit. Sophie could feel the letter burning a hole through the walls upstairs. She swallowed. Maybe Grandma just finally decided to stop being treated like glass. That made Greg sit back. Elise frowned, uncertain whether to be offended or impressed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," Sophie said softly. But her voice carried a calm she hadn't known she possessed. Just that she was always stronger than people gave her credit for. For once, Elise didn't have a ready reply. Greg set his tablet down slowly. "You talked to her recently?" Sophie shook her head, eyes on her plate. "No." But in her mind, she heard the echo of Helen's handwriting. "You always saw me, so now I see you." Dinner ended in a fragile quiet. Elise pretended to check emails. Greg disappeared into the den. Sophie climbed the stairs, heart racing, and locked her bedroom door behind her. From the window, she could see the lake in the distance, dark under the rising moon. She pulled out her sketchbook, running her fingers over the envelope's edge. Something told her the letter wasn't just a gift. It was a warning. Downstairs, a phone rang, then stopped, then rang again. Elise's voice carried faintly up the hall, strained, demanding. Sophie closed the sketchbook, tucking it beneath her pillow. Whatever Helen had done, the ripples were already reaching them. And Sophie, for the first time, wasn't sure if she was the heir or the messenger. The glass door rattled so hard it nearly came off its hinges. Elise Ward burst into Malcolm's office in a streak of motion. Coat half-buttoned, hair wild from the wind, fury written clean across her face. Ray Dorsey looked up from behind the desk, startled. "Mrs. Ward, don't," Elise snapped, pointing at him. "Don't pretend you didn't know this was coming." Behind her, Greg hesitated in the doorway, his face pale. "Elise, maybe?" "Stay out of this." Her voice cracked like a whip. She turned back to the attorney. "Where is she?" A voice, low but unmistakably composed, answered from the corner. "Right here." Helen stood near the window, hands folded loosely in front of her, a cup of tea cooling beside her. She looked small in the wide frame of the office, but nothing about her seemed fragile. Her expression was almost serene, the kind that came from making peace with something irreversible. Elise's voice shook. "You went behind my back." Helen tilted her head. "Back implies I owed you my front." For a moment, neither spoke. The steady hum of the city outside filled the silence. The rush of cars, the thrum of distant sirens. Life moving forward while theirs stalled. Ray cleared his throat, trying to re-establish order. "Perhaps it's best we—" "No," Elise cut in, pacing the room like a caged thing. "You don't get to play moderator, Ray. You helped her do this. You rewrote my family's entire history while pretending to be neutral." Helen's gaze never wavered. "This isn't history, Elise. It's consequence." "Consequence?" Elise turned, incredulous. "You took everything, the house, the downtown building, even the foundation Dad built." Malcolm's portrait hung behind the desk, and for a flicker of a second, it almost seemed to watch them. His eyes caught in the light from the window. Elise pointed at it. "What would he say about this?" From the hallway came the slow, measured voice of Malcolm himself. "He'd say she didn't owe you a co-author credit on her legacy." Elise spun around. Her father stood framed in the doorway, thinner than she remembered, his cane planted firmly beside him. His tone wasn't angry, just steady, cold as stone. "Dad," Elise's voice faltered. "You knew?" "I did," he said, "because it was her decision. And before you start, no, this isn't Sophie's doing." Elise's breath came shallow. "She manipulated her. She's been playing you both, the sweet little granddaughter act. You can't honestly think she—" "Sophie had nothing to do with it," Malcolm said. "Helen made her own choices, as she always has. You just didn't think she still could. That struck something deep." Elise's face reddened. "You're both unbelievable. I spent years taking care of this family while she sat in that lake house pretending she still mattered." Helen finally spoke, calm but firm. "You said I had nothing left to offer, Elise." The room went still. Helen's voice softened just slightly. "So I gave you exactly that." Elise's mouth opened, then closed again. Her jaw clenched, eyes glassy with disbelief. For a moment it seemed she might cry, but she didn't. She straightened instead, lifting her chin as though defiance could steady her trembling hands. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. "I already did," Helen replied. "That's why I stopped." Greg stepped forward, as if to reach for Elise's arm, but she was already moving. Her heels struck the tile in sharp, uneven beats as she stormed toward the door. The sound echoed through the corridor, each step more furious than the last. Greg hesitated, half a breath, half a decision, then followed silently. The office fell into an almost eerie quiet. Ray busied himself with the stack of documents, as though shuffling paper could disguise the aftershock hanging in the air. Malcolm leaned his cane against the desk, exhaling. "She's going to make this ugly." Helen took a sip of her now cold tea. She already did. Through the window, rain began again, thin at first, then heavier, streaking the glass with trembling lines that blurred the skyline beyond. Helen watched it fall, her reflection merging with the gray city outside. Ray approached hesitantly. I'll finalize the notifications, Mrs. Ward. Shall I send confirmation to your home? Helen nodded. Yes, but use the lake address. I won't be here much longer. Malcolm studied her. You're going back? I left something unfinished there, she said, her eyes still fixed on the rain. And if I don't face it, she'll think she can still rewrite the ending. Her husband's voice softened. And what if she tries anyway? Helen's reflection met his in the window, two older faces blurred by distance and memory. Then she'll learn what a quiet woman sounds like when she stops being quiet. She turned toward the door, calm, deliberate, her hand steady on the knob. Outside, in the hallway, Elise's angry footsteps had already faded, but somewhere in their echo, a storm was gathering speed. The soft glow of a computer screen lit Isabel Crane's face as she typed the final line of the press release. The Whitford Art Legacy Fund will provide mentorship and financial support to emerging women artists in the greater Seattle area. The founder has chosen to remain anonymous. She reread it twice, then hit publish. The cursor blinked once, then disappeared as the update went live. In the quiet of the Ward Art Foundation office, she leaned back, exhaling. The name, Whitford, had been Helen's idea, chosen after the lake where her marriage had begun, long before the years of bitterness and polite estrangement. It was a name that would mean nothing to Elise, and everything to Helen. 3 hours later, Elise Ward scrolled through her email while sitting at her kitchen counter, coffee gone cold beside her. Most of it was junk: newsletters, a reminder for Sophie's tuition payment, a discount code for an interior design firm. Then she saw it. Subject line: The Whitford Art Legacy Fund launches to empower female artists. Her thumb hovered, then tapped. As the article loaded, her pulse began to thud in her ears. There it was, a full-page announcement, a glowing piece in the Seattle Arts Journal. The fund was substantial: multi-property endowment, 6-figure initial grant, long-term support for artists in need. The anonymous founder had, according to the piece, demonstrated a lifelong commitment to beauty, integrity, and creative independence. No name, no hint, but the description was unmistakable. Elise felt the blood rush to her face. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. Greg looked up from across the room, where he was tightening a loose cabinet hinge. What? She turned the screen toward him, voice rising. This! Look at this! He wiped his hands and took her phone. As he read, something shifted in his expression, something close to admiration, or maybe resignation. He handed the phone back. You always said she was irrelevant, he said quietly. Now she's funding the future. Elise stared at him, speechless for a beat. Don't you dare romanticize this. She's flaunting it, humiliating me publicly without even putting her name on it. Greg leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. She didn't put her name on it because she didn't need to. That's the point. Don't start with the philosophy, Greg. He didn't. He just looked at her for a long time, then said, You told her she had nothing left. She's proving you wrong without saying a word. Elise's hand tightened around her coffee mug until she thought it might shatter. This isn't some noble act. It's revenge dressed in virtue. From the doorway came a calm voice. It's not revenge, Helen said. It's redistribution. Elise spun around. Her mother stood there, rain still clinging to her coat, hair damp, cheeks flushed from the cold. She'd arrived silently, as though the house itself hadn't dared to announce her. Greg stepped aside, tension flickering in his eyes. Elise laughed, short, disbelieving. You just show up uninvited now. Helen removed her gloves slowly, methodically. I don't need an invitation to see my granddaughter. Don't you mean your chosen successor? Elise shot back. Your little protege with the sketchbook full of secrets. Helen didn't flinch. Sophie understands art the way you understand control. Both have their uses. That's rich, Elise said. You think this anonymous stunt changes anything? Helen's eyes softened. No, but it gives something back to someone who deserves it. For a moment, the kitchen was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Elise opened her mouth to respond, but Greg spoke first. You two are saying the same thing. You just don't realize it. Both women turned toward him. He met Elise's gaze. You're furious because she acted without you. She's calm because, for the first time, she didn't need your permission. Helen gave the faintest nod. He's right. Elisa's lips parted, but no words came. Her face was pale now, her voice barely above a whisper. You think this makes you better than me? No, Helen said quietly. It makes me free. Elise blinked hard, her composure cracking for the briefest instant. Then she turned away. You can have your freedom, just don't expect forgiveness. Helen smiled faintly. Forgiveness is your burden, not mine. She stepped past her daughter and placed a hand on Greg's arm in passing, a small gesture, almost grateful, then left without looking back. Outside, the sky was dimming into violet. Across town, in a small art studio, Sophie sat at her desk surrounded by portfolios. She was curating the first round of applicants, young women with smudged hands, hungry eyes, and dreams that smelled like turpentine and hope. She flipped through an application from a 19-year-old muralist from Tacoma, her charcoal sketches rough but alive. Sophie smiled, sensing what Helen had meant by redistribution. On her phone, a new message appeared from an unknown number. You don't know what she started. Be careful who you trust. The phone buzzed again, then went silent. Sophie stared at it, pulse quickening. The sender ID was blocked. She turned toward the studio window, where the reflection of the Whitford Fund's website banner glowed faintly from her laptop screen. Helen's vision taking shape, unsigned but unmistakable. The lake in the photo behind the banner looked still, too still. The county courthouse was colder than Helen remembered. Not the temperature, the light, the sterile kind that flattened everything into grayscale, leaving no room for sentiment or subtlety. She sat at the long oak table beside Malcolm and her attorney, a navy scarf knotted neatly around her neck. The scarf wasn't for warmth, it was armor. Across from her, Elise sat rigid, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her lawyer whispered something, but Elise wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on her mother, equal parts fury and disbelief, as though she still couldn't accept that it had come to this. The hearing had begun an hour ago, but to Helen it felt much longer. Elise's petition, formally titled Ward versus Ward, Petition for Guardianship and Mental Evaluation, alleged diminished cognitive function and susceptibility to external manipulation. Translation: Helen was too old and too sentimental to be trusted with her own mind. Judge Halstead, an even-tempered man with reading glasses perched on his nose, adjusted a stack of files. Mrs. Ward, he said to Elise, you're asserting that your mother is no longer capable of managing her own estate, correct? Yes, Your Honor. Elise's voice trembled just slightly, then steadied. She's been making erratic decisions, donating assets without consultation, changing legal documents abruptly. It's not normal behavior for her. Helen smiled faintly. That's true. It's not your normal. The judge gave a small warning glance in her direction, but there was the faintest glimmer of amusement in his eyes. Malcolm reached into a folder and slid a flash drive across the table. Your Honor, if I may submit Exhibit D through H. My wife's medical reports, cognitive assessments, and, per your earlier allowance, documented proof of her independent transactions. Elise's lawyer objected on procedural grounds. The judge overruled him without hesitation. Malcolm continued, calm but unyielding. Helen Ward is 71 years old. Her memory slips occasionally. She forgets where she parked, or which day the landscaper comes. But she doesn't forget betrayal, or math, or contracts. These records show time-stamped clarity. Every transfer, every letter, every decision verified, authenticated, and witnessed. Helen turned her head toward Elise, her voice steady. You should know, dear. I kept the receipts. Everyone. The murmurs that rippled through the courtroom made Elise's face flush. The judge nodded. We'll allow the evidence. Proceed. Malcolm tapped the screen of the laptop on the table, bringing up a short video clip. Helen's voice filled the room, recorded just a week earlier, her reading aloud from a recent art journal, discussing the foundation's goals. Her tone was crisp, articulate, composed. This isn't a woman under manipulation, Malcolm said. This is a woman executing a vision. When the clip ended, the silence was deafening. Then Sophie stood. Your Honor, may I? The judge adjusted his glasses. You're Miss Ward? Yes, sir. Helen's granddaughter. Elise's lawyer started to object, but the judge waved him down. Briefly, Miss Ward. Sophie stepped forward, clutching the small notebook she always carried. She's more lucid than half my teachers, Your Honor. She can quote Sontag, bake a pie from memory, and remember every color in a painting she saw 40 years ago. What she doesn't remember, what she chooses not to remember, are the people who made her feel small. Elise's face hardened. Sophie continued, voice soft but unwavering. She's not losing her mind. She's reclaiming it. When she sat back down, Greg rose next. For the first time since the hearing began, Elise looked unsure. Mr. Ward, Judge Halstead said, "You're the petitioner's husband?" Greg nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he paused, then added, "And I'd like to say that Mrs. Helen Ward is sharper than either of us gave her credit for. She doesn't need a guardian. She needs space from people who treat her like a liability." Elise whipped toward him. "Greg!" He didn't look at her. The judge raised his hand, quieting the room. "I've heard enough." He shuffled the papers before him, tapping the gavel lightly against his thumb. "The petitioner has failed to provide evidence of mental incompetence. The court finds Mrs. Helen Ward capable of managing her affairs independently." He looked over his glasses directly at Elise. Case dismissed. The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed through the chamber like a door slamming shut. Helen let out a long, slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Malcolm squeezed her hand beneath the table. Sophie smiled, small, proud, and relieved all at once. Elise sat motionless, eyes burning into the grain of the table. As the courtroom began to empty, Helen rose and gathered her papers. Every movement deliberate, she stopped beside her daughter. "I didn't want to win this way," Helen said softly, "but you left me no choice." Elise's jaw tightened, tears threatening but unshed. "You think you've won?" Helen looked toward the exit doors, sunlight spilling faintly through the courthouse glass. Winning was never the goal. She turned and walked away, her footsteps slow but certain. Behind her, Elise whispered, to herself, to no one, maybe to the echo of the woman she'd just tried to erase, "I'll find another way." The lake was glass again. Morning fog drifted low over the water, turning everything pale and soft-edged, like a memory that refused to fade. Sophie Ward stood at the edge of the dock, a folded deed tucked inside her jacket pocket, the official document naming her sole owner of the cabin, Helen's cabin, her grandmother's heart, bound in cedar and stillness. The place smelled exactly as it had when she was a child: pine needles, damp wood, and faint traces of coffee grounds from a pot that had probably never been washed properly. Sophie brushed her fingers over the weathered railing, the flaking paint rough against her skin. Inside, dust motes floated through the air like tiny ghosts. The old rocking chair by the window creaked in greeting when she touched it. The shelves still held Helen's books: art theory, poetry, gardening, and a single chipped mug with faded lettering. "Make something beautiful, even if it breaks you." Sophie sat on the edge of the couch and let herself breathe. No one was here to watch her cry, so she didn't stop it when the tears came. Slow, quiet, not from grief, but from gratitude. Helen had chosen her. Not for convenience, not for bloodline, but for faith. She opened her sketchbook and drew the curve of the dock, the silhouette of the birch trees across the water. The faint shape of the cabin reflected in the lake. She wrote in the corner, "For her, for the quiet that still speaks." The sound of gravel crunching outside startled her. She turned to see Greg's truck pulling up near the porch. He stepped out slowly, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the chill. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, voice low. "You didn't." Sophie wiped her cheeks quickly. "How'd you even know I was here?" "Courier called the house, said a package had been delivered here for you." Sophie frowned. "Package?" He nodded toward the porch, where a small envelope sat propped against the doorframe. "From Helen, I'm guessing." Sophie reached for it carefully. Inside was a single brass key tied to a strip of blue ribbon. The note beneath it read, "Only, you don't owe me visits. Just care." Sophie exhaled shakily. The handwriting was steady. Helen's way of saying goodbye without actually saying it. Greg watched her read, then said, almost gently, "You know, your grandma, she was right about this place. It always did need someone who could see it for what it is." Sophie smiled faintly. A sanctuary? He nodded. Not a trophy. Before she could answer, the sound of another car tore through the quiet. Elise's black SUV appeared on the road, throwing up a spray of dust as it skidded to a stop behind Greg's truck. "Oh God," Sophie whispered. Elise climbed out, her expression sharp enough to cut glass. "So this is how it ends," she said, marching toward them. "You all conspired behind my back. Mom, you, even Greg." "Elise," Greg began, but she rounded on him. "Don't you Elise me. You stood there in court and sided with her." Her voice cracked on the last word. "With all of them." Sophie stepped forward cautiously. "It's not a conspiracy, Aunt Elise. It's just what Grandma wanted." Elise's laugh was brittle. "Of course you'd say that. You're the one who gets the fairy tale ending, the perfect lake house, the legacy, the praise. Meanwhile, I'm the villain in everyone's story." Sophie's eyes softened. "You don't have to be." That seemed to wound her more than any accusation could have. Elise blinked, her face tightening before she turned back toward the SUV. "Keep your cabin," she said, voice shaking, "but don't pretend it isn't built on betrayal." The car door slammed, echoing across the lake as she sped off. Greg lingered, watching the road until the dust settled. "She'll cool off," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe," Sophie said quietly. He gave a small, uncertain nod and walked back to his truck, leaving her alone again. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that filled every corner until it began to hum. Sophie turned back to the porch, clutching the key Helen had sent. She slipped inside the cabin and found the old guest book that always sat on the entry table, a faded leather journal where every visitor had once signed their name. The first page was dated 1998. In messy, childish handwriting, Elise Ward, age 12, summer with Grandma. "Caught the biggest fish?" Sophie traced the words with her finger, then turned to a blank page near the end. She picked up the pen from the table and wrote slowly, deliberately, "This place remembered me. Sophie Ward, 2025. The ink bled slightly into the paper. She smiled at that imperfection. It felt right. Outside, a gust of wind swept across the lake, rippling the reflection of the trees. For a brief second, she could have sworn she saw Helen's figure in the window's glass, standing tall, peaceful, and proud. Then the vision shifted, and the reflection behind her moved again, this time not hers, not Helen's. A shadow lingered just beyond the porch railing. Watching, Sophie's breath caught. The key slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft metallic ring. The first call went to voicemail. Elise didn't leave a message. She never did on the first round. It was better to catch them live, off guard, before they had time to rehearse loyalty. By the fourth call, she was pacing her kitchen, a legal pad open on the counter, each name neatly underlined. These were Helen's people, gallery partners, donors, former collaborators, the ones who'd once smiled at Elise as though she were an extension of her mother's grace. Now they avoided her like a bad review. She tried again. "Whitman Gallery," a polished voice answered. "Elise Ward calling," she said briskly. "I'd like to speak with Andrew Whitman." A pause. One moment. When he came on the line, his tone was warm but cautious. "Elise, been a long time." "Not long enough," she said. "I'm calling about my mother's recent decisions." "I assume you've seen the headlines." Another pause. "You mean the Whitford Fund? Remarkable work." "She's being manipulated," Elise said. "By Sophie. She's not thinking clearly." "Elise," Andrew said gently, "your mother waited too long to stop being disrespected. We all saw it coming." Her jaw clenched. "Excuse me?" "She's doing what most artists never manage, curating her own ending. Sophie's just helping her frame it." Before Elise could respond, the line went dead. She called another, Lee Reynolds, the woman who used to co-run the foundation board. Lee's voice was flat, polite, the way people speak to someone who's about to embarrass themselves. "She's sharper than ever, Elise. Honestly, I admire her." "You admire her for cutting her family out of her life?" "I admire her for finally knowing where the knife belongs." Elise hung up. Her hand shook as she set the phone down. The list on her notepad looked longer now, though she hadn't written another name. She tried again anyway. Gallery owners, curators, even the old accountant who used to manage Helen's tax filings. Each conversation ended the same way. Sympathy wrapped around quiet judgment. By the time Greg came home, she was sitting at the counter surrounded by empty coffee mugs and the remains of an untouched lunch. "Bad day?" he asked softly. She laughed under her breath. "I just spent 3 hours talking to people who apparently think my mother's a saint." Greg loosened his tie, watching her carefully. "She's not a saint. She's just finally not scared of you." Elise's head snapped up. "Excuse me." He didn't back down. "You're not untrusted because of Sophie. You're untrusted because you burned the bridge and blamed the smoke." Her lip trembled, though her voice stayed sharp. "You sound just like her." Greg sighed, rubbing his face. "Then maybe she's been right all along." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Elise stared at him like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. "You used to defend me." "I used to think you needed defending," he said. "Now I just think you need distance." He walked past her toward the stairs, pausing only long enough to add, "She didn't rewrite the will to punish you, Elise. You lost her before she ever picked up a pen." The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of everything she hadn't said. 2 nights later, the downtown gallery reopened after renovations, a sleek, modern space with high ceilings and soft gold lighting. The crowd was elegant, subdued. Near the entrance, Helen stood quietly beside Malcolm, her hand looped through his arm. She wore a deep green shawl, the color bringing out the steel in her eyes. Her name wasn't anywhere on the walls, but it didn't need to be. The new North Wing, its installation of young women's work, bold and unflinching, had been paid for almost entirely by her donation. As the curator spoke from the stage, Helen's gaze drifted toward the far corner of the gallery. Through the crowd, she caught a glimpse of Sophie, laughing softly with 2 other artists, her confidence easy, unforced. The sight brought a quiet warmth to Helen's chest. A reporter approached. "Mrs. Ward, a comment on the new collection." Helen smiled politely. "I prefer to let the art speak. It's far more honest than I could ever be." Laughter rippled softly around her, and for the first time in years, Helen felt at peace, not triumphant, not vindicated, just still. From across the street, hidden in the reflection of the gallery glass, Elise watched. Her hair was pulled back, her face shadowed beneath the streetlights. She could see Helen surrounded by admirers, Sophie radiant near the exhibit, Greg lingering by the bar, an entire world that no longer needed her. Elise lifted her phone. The screen glowed with a draft message. "You think it's over. It isn't." She hovered over the send button. Then slowly, her thumb moved, past delete, toward a contact labeled simply Private Investigator, JD, 1 tap. The cursor blinked. "Ready when you are." The reply appeared almost instantly. Elise exhaled, slipping the phone into her coat pocket. The city lights shimmered against the glass as she turned away, disappearing into the dark. The email came from a name Helen barely remembered, Lydia Trent, a freelance writer she'd met once at an art gala years ago. The subject line was disarmingly casual. A small story about big influence. Helen almost deleted it. For decades, she'd been the woman in the background of other people's success. The donor, the patron, the one who smiled for photos but never courted the spotlight. Publicity now felt almost indecent. But something in Lydia's note caught her eye. "You've built half this city's art scene in silence. I'd just like to make sure it's written down before silence swallows it again." Helen read it twice, then sighed. One small interview, she thought. Just one. The cafe chosen for the meeting was tucked inside an old bookstore downtown. Quiet, warm, the kind of place where conversation felt protected. Lydia arrived early, a notebook already open, her pen poised like she'd been waiting her whole life to ask this particular set of questions. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said. "I know privacy's sacred to you." Helen smiled faintly. "At my age, privacy's the only thing I haven't donated." They both laughed softly, the ice broken. For the next hour, Lydia asked about everything but money. She asked about the first painting Helen ever bought, a watercolor of a lake I couldn't afford but bought anyway. About how she'd chosen to support women artists. Because men already had their wings, Someone had to give women wind. And about the Whitford Fund, it was never about me. It was about what would outlast me. When Lydia asked why she'd chosen anonymity, Helen's gaze drifted toward the window. Because recognition is temporary, respect is permanent, and I already wasted too many years confusing the two. The younger woman nodded, writing fast, eyes bright. At the end, Lydia closed her notebook gently. If I could title this, she said, I'd call it The Quiet Patron Who Built the Scene. Helen chuckled. That sounds too kind. It's not kind, Lydia said. It's accurate. The profile ran 2 weeks later in Seattle Art and Life, a modest publication with a loyal readership. The piece was simple, elegant, reverent. Behind every exhibit that changed the city's creative landscape, there was Helen Ward, quiet, deliberate, uncredited. A benefactor who believed art doesn't belong to people. It belongs to courage. No photo, just a black and white image of the lake at sunrise. The same view from the cabin window. Within hours, it was everywhere. Artists reposted it. Former interns, curators, even museum staff shared it with captions like, "About time." It spread quietly but persistently, like morning light creeping into every forgotten corner. And Elise, whose feed used to be full of tags and mentions, watched as her friends circulated the article without tagging her once. Not a single mention, not one attempt to link her name back to the woman who had built her entire social standing. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Then she realized it was the new truth. She slammed her laptop shut, her reflection trembling in the black screen. "You wanted silence, Mother," she muttered. "Let's see how loud it gets when I'm done." Across town, in her studio, Sophie clipped the article from the magazine. She trimmed the edges carefully with a dull pair of scissors and pinned it inside her sketchbook beside Helen's old letter, the one that had started everything. The title at the top of the page read like a benediction. The Quiet Patron Who Built the Scene. She smiled softly. That's all she needed, she whispered. Later that evening, Helen arrived at the studio unannounced, a thermos of coffee in hand. Sophie looked up, startled but pleased. "I saw the piece," Sophie said. "You were beautiful in print." Helen set the thermos down and pulled up a chair. "That's all I needed. 1 page of record. After that, the truth can take care of itself." Sophie grinned. "It already is." From the back corner, Isabel Crane, now the director of the Whitford Fund, leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Legacy whispers," she said, her tone half musing, half warning. "Unless insulted, then it writes." Helen looked up at her, amused. "You make it sound dangerous." "It is," Isabel said quietly, "because legacy doesn't fade. It waits." That night, as the studio emptied, Helen lingered alone for a moment. Through the window, she could see the city lights flickering like stars that refused to dim. The printed article sat open on the work table, Lydia's words catching the lamplight. Helen reached for her pen and underlined a single sentence. She never raised her voice, yet she reshaped the room. She smiled. "Not bad for a final act," she murmured. But then her phone buzzed, once, sharply. A message from an unknown number. "They're not done with you." Her hand froze over the page. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a car engine idled just long enough to be heard, then faded into the night. The courtroom was smaller this time. No crowd, no press, no gallery of onlookers whispering through the proceedings. Just the scrape of chairs, the echo of a gavel, and the dull fluorescent hum that always seemed to drain the warmth from human voices. Elise sat at the petitioner's table, posture stiff, her expression carved into practiced composure. Her lawyer shuffled a stack of folders, but the slump in his shoulders betrayed what they both knew. This wasn't going to work. At the other end of the table, Sophie sat quietly beside Malcolm, her sketchbook balanced on her lap, fingers whirring the corner of a page. Helen's chair was empty, by design. Her absence felt deliberate, even in death. Judge Halstead looked older than the last time they'd stood before him, his glasses perched low, his voice slow, deliberate. "We're here regarding the late Mrs. Helen Ward's estate and the motion filed by the petitioner to contest the distribution of assets." He adjusted his notes, scanning the room. "Let the record show the trust in question was established as irrevocable under state law." executed while Mrs. Ward was in full possession of mental capacity, verified and witnessed by multiple parties. He paused, his gaze flicking briefly toward Elise. In layman's terms, Mrs. Ward's wishes stand. Elise's lawyer cleared his throat, forcing a measured tone. Your Honor, we believe undue influence. Judge Halstead raised a hand. You've made that argument before, Counselor. And every affidavit, every time-stamped document, every testimony, including those from your own witnesses, contradicts it. The motion is denied. The gavel's sharp crack was final. The sound seemed to ripple through Elise like a physical blow. For a moment she didn't move. Then she rose, slow and mechanical, gathering her papers as if ritual might soften defeat. Sophie stood too, hesitant, searching her aunt's face for something, understanding, surrender, maybe just peace, but found only the hard gleam of humiliation. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon light was cold and brittle. Sophie lingered by the steps, while Elise stopped under the portico, arms folded tight against herself. Greg was nowhere to be seen this time. Elise, Sophie said softly, approaching. Wait. Her aunt didn't turn. You win, I guess. It wasn't about winning, Sophie said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a flat, wrapped canvas. Here. Elise blinked, suspicious. What is this? Sophie unwrapped it, revealing a painting, a small winter gray landscape of the cabin by the frozen lake. Smoke curled faintly from its chimney, but no one was in the frame, only snow, trees, and still water. It's a memory, Sophie said quietly, since that's all you kept. Elise's throat tightened. For a long second, she said nothing. Her gloved fingers brushed the edge of the frame, tracing the painted outline of the house she'd once loved and lost. You think this fixes anything? No, Sophie replied. But maybe it reminds you that once it didn't have to break this way. Elise looked away, blinking too quickly. You sound like her. Sophie gave a small, sad smile. I know. When she walked away, Elise didn't call her back. The painting trembled slightly in her hands as a gust of wind swept through the courthouse steps, scattering a few dead leaves across the concrete. Weeks passed. The art world moved on. The Whitford Fund continued under Isabel Crane's direction, and the magazine that had once named Helen the Quiet Patron released a short editorial tribute. She gave without needing her name attached, and in doing so, made her name impossible to forget. Sophie attended the memorial alone. Malcolm stayed home, his health failing, but his voice had carried in the note he sent her with. You're the one who sees her clearly. Keep seeing. After the service, Sophie stood by the lake cabin, now hers in name and deed, watching the water break the light into tiny shards. A courier arrived just as dusk began to settle. A small envelope, Helen's handwriting, inside, a single line on heavy cream paper. You never owe me legacy, just continuation. Sophie pressed it to her chest, eyes closing. In the distance, across the still lake, she thought she saw a light flicker in the woods. A faint orange glow, gone as soon as she noticed it. Probably nothing. Probably. Morning light crept through the curtains in thin, trembling lines. It touched the edge of the nightstand, the rim of a teacup, the stack of half-read poetry books beside the bed. Helen Ward didn't move. Her hands were folded neatly on the quilt, her face softened into the gentlest expression of rest. There was no struggle, no witness, no sound. Only the hush that comes when a life ends exactly as it intended to, without interruption. By the time Sophie arrived at the cabin later that day, the air already carried that peculiar stillness that lingers after loss. A nurse from the hospice company stood near the door, her tone hushed, efficient, practiced in sympathy. Sophie barely heard her words. She went quietly, the woman said, like she just drifted. Sophie nodded, unable to speak. She moved toward the bedroom, her eyes tracing the small details that hadn't changed. The mug still on the desk, Helen's cardigan draped over the chair, the faint scent of cedar and paint. On the dresser sat a small envelope, her name written across the front in Helen's steady handwriting. Sophie's breath hitched. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it carefully. Inside was a folded letter, and beneath it, a small metal box, the kind that used to hold Helen's paintbrushes. The letter began simply, in blue ink, "My Sophie. If you're reading this, I've managed what I always wanted, to leave quietly. I never liked the drama of goodbyes. I found them wasteful. You already knew what you meant to me, but I'll write it anyway, so it stays somewhere you can touch. I loved you for seeing me when others only saw age. You didn't treat me like history. You treated me like possibility. That's a rare gift, and it's why the lake, the art, the silence, they're all yours now. You'll find my journals in the study and my paint set in the box beneath this letter. The deed to the gallery loft, yes, the one we stood in when the Whitford show opened, is now in your name too. Do what you want with it. Hang your art, or burn the walls down and start new. Either way, it's continuation. Remember, nothing loud ever lasts. Make your legacy a whisper that lingers longer than applause. Love, always, Grandma Helen." Sophie pressed the letter to her lips, her shoulders trembling. The metal box was heavier than she expected. Inside, the brushes were wrapped in cloth, worn handles polished by decades of work. Beneath them lay one small glass jar of dried paint water, still faintly tinted blue. She laughed through the tears. "You kept this?" Outside, the lake was perfectly still, so still it reflected the cabin as if nothing inside had changed. The memorial was small, just as Helen would have wanted. The sun dipped low, glinting off the water as a handful of friends and artists gathered near the dock. Isabel spoke briefly about legacy, about generosity without vanity. Malcolm sat in his wheelchair, quiet, eyes glistening. Greg stood apart from the group, head bowed, hands in his pockets. When he finally stepped forward to greet Sophie, his voice was soft and cracked around the edges. "She deserved peace," he said, "and I think she found it." Sophie nodded. "She made it herself." He looked at her then, really looked. "You know, she told me once that you were her redemption. I didn't understand it then." Sophie smiled faintly. "Neither did I." The ceremony ended without music, without speeches, just silence, the kind Helen might have painted if she'd lived one more day. Before everyone left, Sophie unfolded a small piece of paper from her pocket, the poem Helen had loved for decades, written in her own looping script. She read it aloud, her voice trembling but clear. "Nothing loud ever lasts. The wind quiets, the waves settle, and what remains is the reflection, soft and still and true." The crowd stood in reverent quiet. Even the lake seemed to listen. After they dispersed, Sophie stayed behind. She walked to the dock, the folded letter still in her hand, and whispered, "You got your quiet ending, but I'm not done yet." A breeze lifted, rippling the surface of the lake, scattering the reflection of the sky. When Sophie turned to head back toward the cabin, something glinted near the tree line, a faint flash, like metal catching light. She paused, squinting, but the shimmer vanished. It could have been sunlight on the water, or someone watching from the woods. Either way, the quiet no longer felt so peaceful. The morning the Whitford Art Fund reopened its doors, Seattle was wrapped in a steady drizzle, thin silvery rain that blurred reflections on every window downtown. Sophie Ward, 18 now, stood beneath the overhang outside the foundation building, her breath fogging in the cold. The new sign gleamed faintly above the entrance, the Whitford Center for Emerging Artists. She hesitated for just a second before pushing open the glass doors. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnish and linen. The boardroom waited at the end of a long corridor, quiet except for the sound of soft footsteps and distant conversation. Sophie adjusted the strap of her sketchbook bag and stepped in. The room was large but warm, its walls a muted cream, the windows tall enough to let in the gray light. Around the table sat a mix of board members, curators, and artists. At the head of the table stood Isabel Crane. When Isabel saw her, she smiled through tears she didn't bother to hide. "You made it," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Helen would have loved this." Sophie nodded, unsure whether to sit or stand, her heart hammering in her chest. She was wearing her grandmother's old scarf, the one that still carried a faint scent of oil paint and cedar. "I still can't believe you want me here," she said quietly. Isabel crossed the room and took her hand. "Helen built this boardroom for you. You just didn't know it yet." Sophie looked around. The walls were lined with pieces Helen had once adored. A watercolor of the lake at dawn, a small portrait of a woman's hands stained with pigment, a modern sculpture built from recycled copper wire. Every piece had been chosen by Sophie over the past few months, each tagged in the ledger as curated by S. Ward. She walked toward the far wall, where Helen's favorite hung, a mixed media collage of light, shadow, and torn letters, layered into a haunting mosaic. Beneath it was a brass plaque engraved simply, dedicated to the quiet patron. No name, just the title. Sophie reached out and brushed her fingers lightly across it. She'd have hated anything louder than this. Isabel laughed softly. Exactly why we kept it that way. The meeting began soon after. Reports were read, budgets presented, plans outlined. The Whitford Fund, it turned out, had grown beyond anything Helen could have imagined. Applications for grants had tripled in a year. Donations poured in after the magazine feature, but one recent addition had startled even Isabel. Last quarter, Isabel said, glancing toward Sophie, an anonymous donor matched Helen's final gift. Every dollar of it. No letter, no name, just a wire transfer and a message that said, for what she started. The room buzzed softly, every face turning toward Sophie, though she hadn't said a word. She looked down, tracing the edge of the table with her thumb. She knew who it had to be. Greg. The quiet apology he couldn't say any other way. After the meeting, Isabel handed Sophie a binder, thin, embossed in gold. Your grandmother's archive, she said. Every note, every draft, every handwritten idea she ever made for this place. She called it the boardroom I built for her. I think she meant you. Sophie opened it carefully. The first page was blank except for one line, written in Helen's looping script. Build quietly, so they never forget who taught you how. Her throat tightened. She really thought of everything, Isabel smiled sadly. She thought of you. Sophie turned toward the window. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving streaks of silver on the glass. From this angle, she could see the reflection of the room, the table, the paintings, the people Helen had gathered without ever raising her voice. She built this in the dark, Sophie said softly. So we could keep the lights on, Isabel nodded. And you will. That night, when the building was empty and the city was asleep, Sophie returned to the boardroom alone. She switched off all but one light and stood in front of the painting of the lake. The glass reflected her faintly, young, uncertain, but rooted. She took Helen's pen from her bag and wrote on a small scrap of paper, sliding it under the frame. For the next generation, whoever they are, keep it honest. As she turned to leave, the motion sensors flickered. One light in the hallway, then another. A shadow moved briefly at the far end of the corridor. Sophie froze. It lingered for just a second, tall, still, indistinct, then disappeared around the corner. Her heart pounded. She exhaled slowly, whispering to herself, You said it best, Grandma. Nothing loud ever lasts. But as the final light dimmed, the building gave one soft, echoing creak, like the weight of unfinished business shifting in the dark. The lake trail was softer than Sophie remembered, the ground still damp from last night's rain. Fallen birch leaves clung to her boots as she walked the narrow path that curved along the shoreline. The air smelled faintly of pine and smoke, some distant chimney still burning off the cold. This was where Helen used to walk in the mornings, the path she called her daily meditation. Sophie hadn't been here in months. The board meetings, grant applications, and endless phone calls had swallowed her days. But something about tonight, about the hush that came with autumn, had pulled her back. She stopped at the bend where the trees parted, revealing the cabin across the water. The lake reflected it perfectly, window light trembling across the surface. It looked almost like it did in her childhood sketches, when she'd drawn it 100 times, without ever realizing it would someday be hers. Sophie sat on a fallen log and pulled a letter from her coat pocket. The edges were worn, the paper soft from being unfolded too many times. Helen's first letter, the one that had arrived years ago with the trust papers. My Sophie, you always saw me, so now I see you. You never asked for anything, which is why I can finally give you something that matters. The lake will be yours someday, the quiet, the space to breathe, the sound of water that never lies. Don't let anyone convince you it's too much. You earned it by being kind when no one else knew how. The ink had faded slightly, but the words still glowed in their own way. Sophie read them aloud under her breath, her voice barely carrying over the rippling water. A twig snapped behind her. She turned and froze. Elise stood at the edge of the trail, half in shadow, half in the pale spill of moonlight. She looked thinner, older. Her hair, once perfectly styled, was pulled back loosely. Her eyes held a kind of quiet that wasn't peace, but exhaustion. "Sophie," she said softly. "I called. You didn't answer. I know. I needed to see you." Sophie folded the letter carefully and stood. "Why?" Elise hesitated. "Because I'm tired of losing everything that had my name on it." "It was never your name that mattered," Sophie said, her tone even but firm. "It was what you did with it." Elise's jaw tightened. "You sound like her. That's not an insult." Elise took a step closer, but Sophie didn't move. "Can we start over?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to be human. "Just talk?" Sophie shook her head slowly. "No." The word wasn't cruel, just final. Elise looked down at the dirt path, then back toward the cabin lights flickering across the lake. "You think forgiveness makes you stronger?" Sophie's voice softened. "No, I just learned that not giving it doesn't make me weaker." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Elise turned away, her figure dissolving back into the woods, the way mist disappears into water. When the sound of her footsteps faded, Sophie sat again, heart steady. The wind shifted, brushing through the birches with the same whispering rhythm Helen used to hum when she painted. Back in the city, Isabel found her in the office late one evening, papers spread across the conference table. The fluorescent lights buzzed quietly overhead. "You're writing again," Isabel said, setting down a cup of coffee. Sophie didn't look up. "A new grant program." "For what?" "For those building in silence," Sophie said. "Artists who create without applause. The ones who keep the lights on when no one notices." Isabel smiled faintly. "Some people repair legacies," she murmured. "Others repaint them." Sophie closed her laptop and leaned back, eyes tired but clear. "I'm not repainting anything, just carrying the color forward." The two women sat in quiet understanding. On the final page of the proposal, Sophie had written the dedication in small type, "In memory of Helen Ward, the quiet patron." The name appeared only once, in the fine print, just as Helen would have wanted. Outside, the streetlights flickered against the windows, their glow faint but persistent. Sophie turned off the lamp, leaving only that thin light from the city. "She built it in the dark," she whispered. "Now it's my turn to keep it that way." She gathered her notes and stepped out into the hall. The building creaked once, a soft, familiar sound that didn't frighten her this time. It felt like approval. The Whitford Center glowed from the inside out that night, its glass facade spilling warm light across the rain-slicked Seattle street. For the first time since its founding, the building was filled not with donors or executives, but with artists, young, nervous, proud, each standing beside the work they'd made possible through Helen Ward's fund. Sophie moved quietly through the crowd, clipboard tucked under her arm, her grandmother's scarf looped once around her neck. She'd spent months planning this, the first Whitford Legacy exhibition, featuring 20 local artists who had once written to her with nothing but a dream and a portfolio too thin to impress anyone else. Now their paintings, sculptures, and installations filled the room like 100 small resurrections. The air hummed with conversation, laughter, clinking glasses, the sound of hope finding its footing. A mural of the lake Helen had loved stretched across the east wall, painted by a 20-year-old named Lila Torres. Beneath it, a brass plaque read only, "Made possible by the Whitford Fund." No Helen, no Sophie, no surnames at all. Near the entrance, Isabel stood beside a cluster of reporters, smiling like a woman who finally believed in the endurance of quiet things. When she caught Sophie's eye, she mouthed, "You did it." Sophie shook her head softly. "We did." A reporter, mid-30s, sharp suit, notebook in hand, approached her as she turned to greet one of the artists. "Ms. Ward," he asked, "a quick question for the feature piece. Why keep your grandmother's name so quiet? Most families would have built a monument out of this." Sophie smiled, the kind that was both genuine and slightly defensive, because she wanted to build, not brand. The reporter blinked. That's poetic. She was, Sophie said simply, before excusing herself. She walked toward the back of the gallery, where a small stage had been set for the evening's short remarks. She wasn't planning to give a speech. Helen had never liked speeches. But as she watched the crowd mingle under the warm lights, she realized Helen's philosophy had worked. The art spoke louder than anyone could. And yet, in the far corner, one face caught her off guard. Greg. He stood half in shadow, hands clasped, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. He looked older, worn by years and silence, but there was peace in his posture. When Sophie met his eyes, he nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that didn't need words. After a moment, he turned back toward one of the canvases, a soft watercolor of the lake in winter, and lingered there. The piece was unsigned, but he recognized the brushwork. Helen's final unfinished painting, restored and completed by Sophie herself. He exhaled, whispering to no one, "You did it. Helen." Across town, in a house dim except for the light of a single television, Elise watched the coverage of the exhibition on the evening news. The reporter's voice was chipper. A new generation of artists celebrated tonight at the Whitford Center, thanks to the enduring vision of late philanthropist Helen Ward. Elise's reflection hovered over the screen, her face pale, lips pressed tight. The camera panned across the crowd, catching Sophie for a brief second, then Isabel, then Greg. Her own name was never mentioned, not once. She muted the TV but didn't turn it off. The silence that filled the room wasn't peaceful, it was sharp, buzzing at the edges. She stared at the framed photo of her mother on the bookshelf, the one she'd refused to take down even after the will, the hearings, the humiliation. "You got what you wanted," Elise whispered. "They all did." Her fingers traced the edge of the frame. "But I'm still here." She set the picture face down and turned back toward the flickering screen. Sophie's voice came faintly through the muted feed, mid-sentence. Something about gratitude and continuation. Elise watched her niece's lips move, graceful and assured. And for a moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Not jealousy, exactly, but recognition. "You sound just like her," she murmured. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping against the windows with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. Back at the exhibition, the lights dimmed slightly as the crowd gathered around the mural for the evening's closing. Sophie stood at the microphone, her voice calm but resonant. "This fund was built in silence," she said, "by a woman who believed creation mattered more than credit. Every artist here tonight carries a piece of that belief forward. That's the only legacy that ever lasts." Applause rippled through the room, not loud but warm, sustained. When it faded, Sophie looked toward the entrance. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw someone standing in the doorway. A woman's silhouette, still and familiar. The angle of the shoulders, the tilt of the head. Her pulse quickened. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. Only rain streaked down the glass. The cemetery sat on a low hill outside the city, the kind of place where the silence didn't feel empty, it felt earned. A soft wind moved through the rows of headstones, stirring the birch leaves above Helen Ward's grave. The tree she'd planted decades ago now stretched tall and slender, its branches whispering like it was still taking instructions from her. Sophie stood at the edge of the plot, holding a thick envelope in one hand, the letter from the Smithsonian. The words inside were still ringing in her head. "We would be honored to preserve the journals and correspondence of the late Helen Ward in our national collection." She didn't open it again. She already knew every line by heart. The ground was damp beneath her boots as she knelt, brushing away a few fallen leaves from the flat granite marker. The inscription was exactly as Helen had wanted. Helen Marie Ward, 1923, 2025, The Quiet Patron. Sophie sat down beneath the birch tree, tucking her coat tighter around her. The air smelled of earth and rain. She set the envelope in her lap and pulled one of Helen's journals from her bag, the oldest one, with paint smudges along the edges and a corner torn from years of use. She opened it at random and found a folded piece of paper tucked inside, a poem Helen had written in her own looping hand. Sophie read it aloud, her voice steady at first, then softer. "I never needed applause, just memory. To be recalled like the shape of morning light on a lake too still to argue with time." Let my silence be mistaken for peace. Let what I built whisper when I'm gone. Sophie smiled faintly. You got what you wanted, Grandma, she murmured. They're whispering. She stayed there for a while, watching the branches sway against the gray sky. The Smithsonian letter crinkled in her hand. She imagined Helen's reaction, probably a small, amused smile, maybe a shrug. She could almost hear her say, "Let them keep it if they promise not to turn it into noise." From her bag, Sophie pulled a second envelope. This one smaller, addressed in her own handwriting. Inside were Helen's journals, carefully catalogued and sealed, along with a single note that read, "For quiet preservation." No signature, no flourish, just as Helen would have written it. She placed the bundle gently beside the gravestone, resting her palm on top for a moment. You gave me everything, she whispered, except the burden of being loud. A sudden gust swept through the trees, scattering leaves across the grave. Sophie watched them fall, golden against the gray stone, until they covered the letter completely. As she stood to leave, she glanced once more at the inscription. Beneath it, someone, Isabel, probably, had left a small bouquet of wildflowers and a note folded under a stone. The corner had curled from the damp, but Sophie could still make out the last line in faded ink. She changed the world by refusing to shout. Sophie smiled through tears. You really did. She walked back down the narrow path toward the car, the Smithsonian letter tucked safely inside her coat. The sky had begun to clear. A patch of blue was breaking through the clouds. At the edge of the cemetery, she turned for one last look. From a distance, the birch tree looked like it was keeping watch. Its branches bent just enough to look protective, almost maternal. Sophie whispered, "I'll keep building, Grandma," quietly. Then she turned and walked away. Later that night, Isabel found Sophie's letter on her desk at the Whitford Center, addressed to the Smithsonian, ready for mailing. Attached was a short note for the archives department. These journals belong to Helen Ward. They're not loud, but they last. At the bottom, written in a familiar looping script Sophie had added from Helen's old notes, was one final line. My daughter said I was just an old woman with nothing left to offer. I offered her the silence that came with cutting her out of everything. Isabel read the sentence twice, her throat tight. She looked toward the darkened gallery beyond her office window, where Helen's lake painting hung, still and luminous under low light. Somewhere in that quiet, the birch leaves outside rattled faintly against the glass, as though the past itself was exhaling, finished but not forgotten.